Right now in Tehran, a statement is being read out on state television that could decide whether this war spreads across the entire Middle East. It comes from a man the world has barely seen since he took power. Mojtaba Khamenei, Iran's new supreme leader, has just warned that the United States is about to learn what he calls unforgettable lessons. And he did not stop there. In the same statement, he looked directly at Donald Trump's signature on the ceasefire agreement both countries signed only weeks ago, and he called it worthless and invalid. Those words were not an accident. They were a message sent on purpose. On the same day, Iran announced it was suspending its commitments to the very deal that was supposed to end this war for good. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you have to go back just a few days. On July 6th and 7th, 2026, 3 commercial vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz were struck. A liquefied natural gas carrier called Al-Rikayat, a very large crude carrier named Wedion, another VLCC called Cyprus Prosperity. These were not warships. These were commercial tankers, carrying fuel the entire world depends on, moving through a waterway that carries roughly 20% of the planet's oil supply. Iran was blamed immediately. The United States responded within hours, launching a new wave of strikes on Iranian targets overnight, and reimposing the oil sanctions that had only just been lifted as part of the ceasefire deal signed the previous month. Then came the moment that changed everything. At the NATO summit in Ankara, Donald Trump stood in front of cameras and said the ceasefire with Iran is over. He called it a waste of time to talk peace with, in his words, the liars in Iranian leadership. Those are not the words of a president looking for an off-ramp. Those are the words of a president who has decided the diplomatic phase is finished. What followed was not a single strike. It was a sustained campaign. United States Central Command confirmed it struck more than 80 targets inside Iran in one wave alone. Days later, the bombing continued for a 6th consecutive night, hitting infrastructure across the country's south. Keshem Island, Bandar Abbas, Chabahar, Iranshar, Bandar-e-Kamir, where American forces destroyed several bridges. Iranian state media reported 8 people killed in that single night, describing the American objective in stark terms, an operation to further degrade Iranian military capabilities. Iran did not absorb these strikes quietly. It answered by hitting American allies across the region, one after another: Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain. And then, in the most recent wave, a coordinated strike hitting Suleimania in Iraq and Bahrain simultaneously, launched, according to Iranian state broadcaster IREB, in direct response to what Tehran called a United States acts of aggression. CBS News reported multiple American service members were injured in the attacks on bases in Jordan. As of the latest count, 14 American troops have died since this war began in late February of 2026. No American fatalities have been confirmed in the most recent wave, but the number of injured continues to climb, and every strike now carries the risk of changing that. This is not the first time Iran has attacked a Gulf partner of the United States since this conflict started. Go back to February 28th, just after the initial coordinated Israeli and American strikes on Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. Iran launched a series of ballistic missiles and drones at the United Arab Emirates, targeting American assets and bases stationed there. 3 foreign workers were killed in that attack: a Pakistani national, a Nepali national, a Bangladeshi national. 58 more were injured. These are not soldiers dying in these strikes. These are the workers, the seafarers, the civilians, caught in a war that keeps widening its blast radius with every passing week. And that brings us to the reason this war is happening at all and why it keeps reigniting no matter how many times a ceasefire gets signed. The Strait of Hormuz. Whoever controls it controls the artery of the global economy. Trump has made no secret of what he wants there. In a Fox News interview, he said the United States is going to keep the strait, and, in his words, will probably run it. He floated calling the operation the guardian angel of the strait, and said more than once that the United States should be paid for securing it. Iran, meanwhile, insists the strait is under its control, not America's, and has used exactly that argument to justify closing it entirely. In the days after the July 6th and 7th tanker strikes, the International Maritime Organization called on all ships to stop transiting the strait altogether. Nearly 6,000 seafarers are currently stranded on board vessels, unable to safely leave the Persian Gulf. The head of the IMO said the situation remains volatile and that fear, uncertainty, and psychological strain are being endured by nearly every crew still trapped in those waters. Now rewind further, because the path to this exact moment has been paved with broken ceasefires, and understanding that pattern is the only way to know what is likely to happen next. In early April 2026, Trump threatened that, in his words, a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not comply with his demands. Hours before his deadline, he reversed course, announcing a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan, contingent on Iran completely, immediately, and safely reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, confirmed Tehran's agreement, saying safe passage would be coordinated through Iran's armed forces. That ceasefire held, barely, for weeks. Direct talks even took place in Islamabad between U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the highest level direct engagement between the two countries since the 1979 revolution. But those talks collapsed without an agreement, and Trump ordered the Navy to begin blockading Iranian ports. Then, in June, everything shifted again. After renewed fighting between Israel and Iran following strikes near Beirut, the United States intervened to stop a wider Israeli-Iranian exchange. And on June 14th, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced the two countries had finalized a memorandum of understanding, a 14-point deal. Trump announced the immediate lifting of sanctions. For a few weeks, it looked like the war might actually be ending. And then, right in the middle of that fragile peace, Iran's supreme leader died. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's death triggered a multi-day funeral procession that brought the entire negotiation process to a standstill. His body was carried through Tehran in calm, mourners gathering by the thousands at Jamkharan Mosque before he was flown to Najaf, Iraq, for burial. Sitting beside his coffin in state media broadcasts was his son and successor, Mojtaba Khamenei, who has now inherited not just his father's title, but a country locked in an active war with the United States, an economy strangled by sanctions, and a population that has spent nearly a year and a half watching its cities get struck from the air. Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared in public since the war began. He has communicated almost exclusively through statements read on state television, and every one of them has escalated the temperature. In his first address, after taking the title of Supreme Leader, he vowed Iran would not surrender to Trump's demands. He said the Islamic Republic has access to important American centers across the region and can act against them whenever it deems necessary, and pointedly noted that the United States gained no real achievement from striking Iran's nuclear sites in the first place. Now, weeks later, with the ceasefire collapsing for what feels like the fourth or fifth time this year, his tone has hardened even further. Unforgettable lessons. Trump's signature, worthless and invalid. Around him, the men who advise him are not softening that message either. They are amplifying it. Mohsen Rezaei, a senior military advisor to the supreme leader and a top official inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, said publicly that Tehran is fully prepared for the United States to launch additional strikes. Trump intends to attack again, he said, and we are fully prepared. That was before the most recent round. After it, Rezaei went further still, warning that if the United States continues what he called its war against the Islamic Republic, Iran could move beyond retaliatory strikes entirely and launch what he explicitly described as a full-scale invasion and annihilation. He said diplomacy and negotiations had ended, and that further American military action could trigger a major escalation beyond anything seen so far in this conflict. A separate advisor close to the new supreme leader delivered an almost identical warning in the same week, saying that if American strikes do not stop within several more days, Iran will move into what he called a phase of full-scale offensive operations. Listen to the language shift here, because it matters. Retaliatory strikes are one thing. Iran has been carrying those out for months, hitting bases, hitting ships, absorbing American counterstrikes, and repeating the cycle. But full-scale invasion, full-scale offensive operations, annihilation. Those are not words used to describe another round of missile exchanges. Those are words used to describe a fundamentally different kind of war, one that does not stay contained to air bases and shipping lanes. So why does Tehran believe it can escalate to this level? Part of the answer sits in the regional map. Iran has now demonstrated it can reach American allies in Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, and the UAE. And it has demonstrated it can strike inside Iraq as well, hitting Sulaymaniyah directly. That is 6 separate countries hosting American assets that Iran has now targeted since this war began. Every single one of those is a pressure point Washington has to defend, and every additional front stretches American air defense, naval assets, and political bandwidth even thinner. Add the closure of the Strait of Hormuz into that equation, and you are not just looking at a regional war anymore. You are looking at a direct hit to global oil markets, to shipping insurance, to inflation, in economies that have nothing to do with this conflict at all. The United States, for its part, has shown no sign of backing down either. Central Command has described its objective in blunt terms, to further degrade Iranian military capabilities, and the pace of the last week alone tells you how seriously that objective is being pursued. 6 consecutive nights of strikes, more than 80 targets hit in a single wave, bridges destroyed, communications infrastructure targeted, sanctions reimposed on Iranian oil exports the moment the ceasefire broke. This is not a campaign designed to send a warning shot. This is a campaign designed to systematically dismantle what is left of Iran's ability to project power, whether that is through its missile stockpiles, its naval forces in the Gulf, or its financial lifeline through oil exports. And that is precisely what makes Mojtaba Khamenei's statement today so consequential. He is not just a new leader trying to prove strength to a domestic audience that watched his father die during an active war. He is a leader who has now publicly and formally rejected the legitimacy of the agreement his own government signed weeks earlier. When he calls Trump's signature worthless and invalid, he is not making a symbolic gesture. He is telling the world that Iran no longer considers itself bound by the terms that were supposed to keep American strikes from resuming, the terms that were supposed to keep the Strait open, the terms that were supposed to keep sanctions lifted. Suspending commitments to an interim deal is, in practical terms, the same as declaring that deal dead. What happens next depends on a handful of decisions being made in Washington and Tehran in the coming days, not weeks. If the United States interprets this statement as a direct threat and responds with another wave of strikes, Iran's own advisors have now put a marker down publicly, several more days of this, and Tehran says it moves into full-scale offensive operations. If Iran follows through on closing the Strait of Hormuz entirely, rather than simply disrupting it through attacks on individual tankers, the economic shockwave alone could force international intervention that goes well beyond the United States, because it is not just American oil interests sitting in that strait. It is the energy security of nations across Asia and Europe that have nothing to do with this fight. There's also the question of what full-scale invasion actually means in this context, because Iran does not currently have the conventional military capacity to invade the American mainland, or even to seriously threaten American territory directly. What officials like Rezaieh are almost certainly signaling is a shift toward direct, large-scale strikes on American military assets and personnel stationed across the region, at a scale beyond the targeted strikes on bases in Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait seen so far. Combined with Iran's proven willingness to strike third-country targets like the UAE and Iraq, that kind of escalation would put nearly every American base in the Middle East within the blast radius of this war, not just the ones directly involved in strikes against Iran. 14 American troops have already died in this conflict since late February. That number, until now, has climbed slowly, spread out over nearly 5 months of intermittent fighting, ceasefires, and collapses. If Iran's advisors follow through on the language they are using this week, the pace of American casualties will not stay slow. And if the United States responds to a full-scale Iranian offensive with the kind of overwhelming force Central Command has already shown it is willing to use, hitting 80 targets in a single wave, 6 consecutive nights of bombing, the humanitarian and economic cost on the Iranian side will climb just as sharply. For now, the world is watching a single statement read out on Iranian state television, delivered by a supreme leader who has still not appeared in public since taking power, buried the moment it aired under threats of unforgettable lessons and a rejected ceasefire. But statements like this, one rarely stay contained to rhetoric for long in this war. Every previous ceasefire in this conflict, in April, in June, has collapsed within weeks, and each collapse has come with harsher language and heavier strikes than the one before it. This is now the pattern. Talk, ceasefire, ceasefire collapse, verbal escalation, and then within days, the airstrikes resume and the map of countries pulled into this fight grows just a little bit larger. To really understand why the Strait of Hormuz keeps pulling this entire war back to the brink every single time, you need to understand exactly what sits inside that narrow stretch of water. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 33 kilometers wide, with usable shipping lanes on each side barely 3 kilometers across. Through that narrow gap passes roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on the planet, plus a massive share of the world's liquefied natural gas. There is no easy detour. Alternative pipelines exist, but nowhere near the capacity to replace what moves through Hormuz every single day. That is why, when Iran disables even a handful of tankers, the entire shipping industry does not wait to see what happens next. It simply stops moving. The International Maritime Organization's call for vessels to halt transit entirely was not a symbolic gesture. It was an acknowledgement that insurance markets, shipping companies, and national governments could no longer guarantee the safety of the people and cargo passing through. Brent crude has swung wildly through every phase of this war, dropping nearly 16% in a single day back in April when the first ceasefire was announced, and now facing renewed upward pressure with every new strike on a tanker or every new Iranian threat to shut the strait down completely. When Trump talks about America becoming what he called the guardian angel of the strait, and insists the United States should be paid for securing it, he is describing a permanent American military presence over one of the most valuable choke points in the global economy, something Tehran has made unmistakably clear it will never accept without a fight. The succession itself adds another layer of instability that most coverage of this war has barely scratched the surface of. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei ruled Iran for over 3 decades, and his death in the middle of an active shooting war with the United States left the Islamic Republic facing a leadership transition unlike anything in its modern history. Past transfers of power in Iran happened during periods of relative calm, giving the clerical establishment time to build consensus around a successor. Mojtaba Khamenei inherited the title in the middle of nightly airstrikes, with his father's funeral procession still working its way from Tehran to Qom to Najaf, while state media was simultaneously reporting fresh casualty counts from American bombing runs. He has not held a single public press appearance since becoming supreme leader. Every message the world has received from him has come filtered through state television, read aloud rather than delivered in person, a pattern that itself has fueled speculation inside and outside Iran about the internal stability of his position, and about how much authority he genuinely commands over commanders like Mohsen Rezai and the wider Revolutionary Guard leadership, publicly setting the terms of Iran's threats. That uncertainty matters because it changes how seriously outside powers have to take every statement coming out of Tehran right now. A newly installed leader, still unseen in public, using his very first major declarations to reject a signed ceasefire and threaten unforgettable lessons, is not operating from a position where backing down quietly is politically survivable. If Mojtaba Khamenei is seen internally as weak in his opening weeks in power, especially while Revolutionary Guard officials are already using language as extreme as full-scale invasion and annihilation, the pressure inside Iran's own power structure may leave him with less room to de-escalate than his father ever had, even if he wanted to. The mediators who kept pulling this conflict back from total collapse earlier in the year are also running out of leverage. Pakistan brokered the April ceasefire with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir personally requesting Trump hold off a planned strike with barely 90 minutes left on the clock. China reportedly gave Khamenei's father a last-minute nudge to accept those same terms. Both countries pushed hard again to help finalize the 14-point memorandum of understanding in June. But mediators can only broker peace between two sides that both still see value in stepping back. Every previous ceasefire bought weeks, not months, before a tanker strike, a Beirut strike, or leadership death dragged both sides back into open conflict. With Tehran now formally suspending its commitments to the interim deal, and Washington already treating the ceasefire as finished, the diplomatic tools that worked twice this year already look far less likely to work a third time. Inside Iran itself, the human cost of this war is not evenly felt. State media has reported casualty figures from specific strikes, 8 dead in the most recent 6-night bombing campaign in the country's south, but independent verification of the true toll across 5 months of fighting remains extremely difficult given restrictions on outside reporting. What is clear is the strain on ordinary Iranians living near military and infrastructure targets in Hormuzgan province and along the southern coast, where bridges, communications towers, and port facilities have absorbed direct hits repeatedly since the war reignited. Every time a ceasefire collapses, it is these communities, not the political and military leadership issuing statements from Tehran, who face the airstrikes first. The question now is not whether there will be another strike. Based on everything happening this week, that outcome already looks close to certain. The question is whether Tehran's new leadership follows through on the language its own advisors are now using in public, and whether Washington's response to that escalation pulls the rest of the region even deeper into a war that was supposed to have ended, on paper, more than a month ago. What happens in the next several days, not the next several weeks, will likely determine whether this becomes the moment the conflict finally breaks its pattern of ceasefire and collapse, and turns into something the region has not seen since this war first began. There is also a wider circle of countries watching this statement with far more anxiety than headlines usually capture. Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Iraq, and the UAE are not combatants in this war by choice. Each one hosts American military infrastructure simply because of decades-old basing agreements signed long before any of this started, and each one has now taken direct Iranian fire as a consequence of hosting that infrastructure. None of these governments have the option of stepping away from Washington without enormous economic and security costs, and none of them have the option of fully shielding their own territory from Iranian retaliation either. That is the trap at the center of this war. Every American strike on Iran increases the odds that one of these 7 countries absorbs the counterpunch instead of the United States directly, and every one of those counterpunches pulls a country deeper into a conflict its own population never voted to join. Qatar in particular sits in an uncomfortable position, hosting the largest American airbase in the region, while simultaneously maintaining a working relationship with Tehran, a balancing act that gets harder to sustain with every new round of strikes traded across its own airspace and waters. There is a version of the next few days where this ends up looking like every previous escalation in this war, a sharp exchange of strikes, international pressure from Islamabad or Beijing, and another temporary truce bought with concessions from both sides. That has happened twice already in 2026, in April and again in June, and there is no rule that says it cannot happen a third time. But there is also a version where it does not, where Mojtaba Khamenei's rejection of the ceasefire and Mohsen Rezai's talk of full-scale invasion turn out to be exactly what they sound like. A signal that Iran's new leadership has concluded that further restraint costs more than further escalation. The difference between those two outcomes will not be decided by another statement on state television. It will be decided by what happens the next time an American aircraft crosses into Iranian airspace, or the next time an Iranian missile lands inside a country that never asked to be part of this war in the first place. For now, the facts on the ground are enough to explain why this moment feels different from the ceasefire collapses that came before it. A supreme leader, still unseen in public, declaring a signed American commitment worthless. A senior Revolutionary Guard advisor, putting the words full-scale invasion and annihilation into the public record. A ceasefire that Washington itself has already declared dead. 6 consecutive nights of American strikes on Iranian soil, and Iranian retaliation reaching into 7 separate countries across the region within the same stretch of days. Whatever comes next in this war, it will not be measured in the language of limited, contained retaliation anymore. Both sides have already told you, in their own words, what they think comes after that.